We are back with a new episode of AI Right, and this week we're delighted to be joined by Ciorsdaidh Watts, Senior Lecturer at the University of Glasgow. Hi Kirsty, thanks for joining us. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. I'm just preparing to get right into teaching in the next couple of weeks, so now's a good time to chat, I think.
Busy period coming up. Well, it's kind of similar to myself. At the moment, it's a pretty good point in the year where we're pretty busy right up until the second week of December, and then our market pretty much shuts down for a month, which is delighted. The guys won't be surprised that I'm going heading away on holiday for Christmas and New Year, so
No way.
some nice time to take some time off. But there you go, you can hear Andy and Megan who are joined with us. How are you doing, guys?
Yeah, good, thank you. Good to see you. And I'm just back from a week's holiday, so I have no right to
Be
review
taking
on
some
your
more time
holidays.
off. Andy and myself were at the on too many holidays, I know. Tell me about it. I was saying Andy and myself were at the Scottish Women in Tech Awards last week, so it was nice to see them outside of the general podcast chat, and we were celebrating because Kat that we work with had won the Inclusive Recruiter of the Year and Mentorship Programme of the Year, so yeah, there was some celebrations
That's cool.
afterwards.
Yeah, 2 awards is amazing. I knew she was up for one, but to win two, wow.
I know
Congratulations.
we were that table though, because it was all obviously technologists and data professionals. To be fair, we weren't a recruitment table. We had loads of people from industry with us, but they would definitely get into the spirit with a drum roll when like Kat was getting announced, because all the data that they were given, it was a certainty it was going to be her. And then with an extra couple of woos when her name get read out. So yeah, we were definitely that table that got overexcited. First time they'd won an award. But anyway, we're not here to chat about that. Kirsty, we've brought you on. Obviously, you've got a background in organic chemistry. Chemistry as a lecturer.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're on to talk about the work that you've been doing in AI ethics. Do you want to give our listeners a bit of an introduction to yourself and your background and how obviously all of this has came about recently?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me on the podcast. We were discussing it just now, and I said, "Oh, my background isn't data science. I'm not a technologist in that sense. So thanks for bringing the outside in, bringing the dark side into the podcast." Yeah, so my background is I did an undergrad straight chemistry degree at Edinburgh. Don't judge me for that. And then I did a year in industry during that undergrad where I worked with AstraZeneca down in Macclesfield. So I was doing oncology discovery work there, and that really kind of sparked my interest in cancer research. So then I did a PhD in cancer research, so it was kind of 50-50 organic synthesis and clinical oncology. So I was really lucky that I had two supervisors that kind of bridged that gap. So it was really interdisciplinary. It was great. Um, and then I did a couple of short postdocs, one where I did my PhD, and then one I came up to Glasgow for the second one. And then from that, I took the role of lecturer in chemistry. So that was my first kind of formal teaching position. I'm now a senior lecturer in chemistry. So I teach the cancer chemistry course to final years. So I still have that focus, but I'm also really interested in pedagogy and the kind of philosophy of teaching, and how tech can be used to enhance learning and teaching. Thinking about like inclusion and diversity of learners. So I'm really interested in that. I've been interested in that for a long time. And over COVID, I worked with a company called LearnSci to develop online kind of digital labs, because obviously students couldn't come into the lab in person. And so that involved simulations of labs, kind of data science in the sense of producing or delivering data that wasn't actually kind of gained from the lab. So that was a really interesting initiative, and I really enjoyed doing that. And yeah, it's kind of started me thinking about, obviously, with the advent of or the increased use of AI, how is AI affecting education? society more generally, and how might we harness it. There's so many opportunities in AI and emerging technologies for like differentiation, inclusion in education, but also, there are big challenges and ethical considerations we need to think about. So without going into too much of my own personal story, I think the reason that I became particularly interested in AI and the ethics around it, I went on maternity leave in 2022 with my second child. So I've got two lovely kids. And my son was born that year with really, really significant health challenges and had a lifelong disability. And we spent a long time in hospital. And I listened to a lot of podcasts actually in that time. And I thought a lot about how I might affect my son's health and social care going forward. Because at that time, there was a lot of conversation about AI, and I was listening to a lot of podcasts. So I started thinking about how, yeah, bias, inclusion, how kind of minoritized groups might be particularly affected, but also the opportunities of AI. And then when I came back after a very extended maternity leave, I was speaking to my colleagues and students, and there was a lot of fear around AI. And I think at the time, the university, and I think this wasn't restricted to Glasgow University at all, there's quite a lot of kind of reactive response to AI, and I think students were really scared. They were scared about punishment, about academic integrity. I would like to say that I think Glasgow is really in the process of and has developed a framework to try and support students to use AI responsibly and meaningfully now. But it was early days, and I think lots of people were frightened, including staff. And I just thought, well, there are so many opportunities. That horse is bolted. There's no way you bring that back. AI is around. There's so many AI technologies that could be so useful, but we need to have really open conversations about questions and the challenges, and how to support students to be critical users of AI, and support them to develop the skills that they'll need a kind of employment market where AI is going to be part of it. So yeah, that's a long-winded way of saying I'm probably not a traditional scientist in the kind of maybe more restricted sense of that. I'm interested in ethics and philosophy anyway, and particularly in education, I suppose, and with emerging technologies.
Wow, such a fascinating story and an introduction to a theme that you've then brought into increasingly closer parts of your direct day-to-day work. I'm interested the extent to which you think Glasgow University in particular has been a good way for you to do that sort of blend of different disciplines, because it's one thing I've spoken about before, having done an undergraduate at Glasgow, that it was quite unique, or the Scottish education system, higher education system broadly, was quite unique in being able to allow a blend of different disciplines. And you said, again, with your PhD, having two supervisors felt quite crucial to you. Do you think that environment has really helped?
I think so, actually, and I think so. I'll speak specifically for Glasgow in a second, but what you said about the Scottish higher education system, I think that has been really important to me, developing a sense that, a scientist, for example, because that is my primary interest, specialism, doesn't need to be restricted. So, for example, when I did my undergrad, in my first few years, as well as chemistry and maths, I did archaeology, and I did archaeology of Scotland because I was really interested in those. I actually applied for a course that was like ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia. I think I didn't do that course, but I think I was the only person that applied. But yeah, I think having that breadth of possibilities in your early years of education is really, really important. And I really like the idea of the kind of Renaissance person, and educating the whole person and not being restricted to only being interested in a specialism. Obviously, I think there's room for excellence, and that's how you get innovation and progress. But I also think there's room for a broad education and broad knowledge. And I actually think that things work best and we progress best when we harness, multidisciplinary work and we collaborate. So I'm really keen on, especially in the area of AI, I suppose, and emerging technologies, I'm really keen on the idea of there not being a divide between technologists and philosophers or technologists and ethicists. I think if we could have a situation where those two groups communicated really well, I think that would be amazing. And specifically for Glasgow, I've just been really, really lucky that the School of Chemistry and actually the university more broadly leaves room, I think, for initiative and full and passive interest. So one of the vice principals that spoke at the lovely Swordskin Symposium on AI ethics this year that I delivered called it a grassroots programme, a grassroots initiative. And I think he might have felt that was a bit disparaging, but I thought the opposite. Like, that's, I think, great that there's an academic institution as old as Glasgow where, a lowly senior lecturer can bring an initiative like this forward and it's supported. Yeah, so I think Glasgow's doing a really good job at trying to make that possible.
No, that's what I was just about to ask you, Kirsty. So you talked about obviously where your interests were and how there was, when the introduction of AI brought a lot of mistrust and nervousness, I suppose, about how it was going to affect courses from a student's and a lecturer's point of view. But so then what was the steps that you took to move that on, to start an initiative? And how, as you said, you had the back in the university, but what have you done so far?
Yeah, so kind of individually or as part of a group, the first thing that I did was, on reflecting on these conversations about fear, about kind of a bit cloak and dagger, like you can't speak about using AI, although we all know that everyone's using it. I really just wanted to open up those conversations. So I worked with the Centre for Data Science and AI at Glasgow, which was a new centre at the time. This was last year, 2024, to deliver the first lovely Swordskin Symposium on AI ethics, which, now looking back, I'm like, that was ambitious. It was a 2.5-day symposium, and it was broad in its focus. So we didn't want it to be just academic. So we wanted it to take in policymakers, governance, tech specialists, and academics. But it had a kind of societal focus. So it was looking at the challenges and the opportunities of AI. We think about, in terms of like race, gender, disability, societal impacts. So that was cool, and we had really great discussions and really great feedback from that. And actually, I want to give a shout out to Lydia Bach, who co-created the symposium with me. She's the College of Science and Engineering EDI officer, and she's like, the best person to work with. She's so good. So that was a real success, and we had students and staff, but we also had external partners, and a lot of them said that you should do it again, like it should happen again. We had the 2025 one just in October, that Andy spoke at, actually. So he spoke as the kind of closing speaker on the first day, and this year our focus was AI in education. But we meant that in its broadest sense. So we meant like education from thinking about, early child brain development, considering AI, all the way through to employability. That's where Andy spoke about employability and thinking about like AI hype, but what do employers really want? And so from those two symposia, I also co-created a MOOC, so like a massive open online course. It's available out with the university, but also is now incorporated in curriculum for our students. It's a free open access course, limited access in terms of time if you're out with the university, but unlimited if you're in the university. And it's called AI Ethics, Inclusion and Society. So we kind of break it down to an introduction to AI, an introduction to ethics, and then thinking about the narratives around AI and imagery around AI and how that impacts what we think about it, and then governance and policy. And then the final week, we think about AI and healthcare and the environment. So like real world examples of where there are opportunities for using AI technologies, but also concern and questions over the impact of these tools. So there's that. I'm the AI champion for chemistry, and I'm on some kind of working groups. And then there's some other symposium and some other conference steering groups that have kind of come from that. But actually, I should say that MOOC was co-created with students. So I've been working with students a lot in the last couple of years on AI and on AI ethics, and that's been great because I think very often what we think students believe about AI actually may not be the case. I think it's super important for students to be at the centre of that conversation and at the centre of kind of determining policy to the extent that that's possible. The university's kind of has an ongoing process at a higher level, right, than the university has an ongoing process of defining policy around AI, and definitely has moved away from like a punitive approach to how do we help students to use AI critically and responsibly. Does that answer your question?
It really does. There were so many
I
follow-ups.
Yeah, there's so many follow-ups. Explore how much your two worlds have come together or not. So you've described a lot of the ethical implications around teaching, impact on students, the way that that's affecting your role as a lecturer and an educator. How much is AI coming closer to and getting involved in the more day-to-day science within your department or within your area? And is that something that equally that growing in knowledge of ethics and best practice is helping you with?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think for sure, it's like a kind of funny wee anecdote, or it might only be funny if you're a chemist actually, but let's see. So, when I first came back from maternity leave, we were having these conversations about AI, and I think a lot of people felt like, oh, well, organic chemists, we have structures, so really AI, like LLMs, there's a world apart. They can't influence the work that we do, because we have structures, and LLMs can't cope with structures, and AI technologies won't be able to cope with structures, which, evidently, I suppose we should have been able to predict this, is not the case now, or it's almost not the case. And so there are lots of fields of chemistry where AI technologies are already hugely beneficial. If you think, so I'm a medicinal chemist, chemical biologist, I suppose, focusing on cancer research. If you just think in terms of imagery and imaging, AI technologies are already kind of making a step change in how imaging is possible, how quickly imaging can take place, and the analysis of imaging. So in medicine, obviously huge changes and huge possibility. And in lots of other areas of chemistry as well. If you just think about computational chemists, lots of chemists that are not in the lab. And in terms of computational chemistry, huge advances. And then if you think, rather than focusing on kind of an academic chemist or an academic scientist, I was speaking recently, I won't name the large pharma companies that I was speaking to, but I was speaking to some representatives from big pharma, and in terms of their portfolios and what they're thinking about and how they're designing, whether it be like traditional small molecules or other modalities, that's all changing, and AI is becoming completely integral into the way their systems work. So there are lots of examples on day-to-day basis.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Kind of
I think
outwork teaching.
I think for me what's really interesting is that we did early on with the creation of large language models assumed that it was going to be confined to the world of natural language and natural conversation, and I guess what we're learning as it starts to have impact in all these different fields is that yes, they might have a different core aim or mechanism, but ultimately there is an underlying language there. There's a language to organic chemistry, there's a language to medicine and discovery, and if there's sufficient data and effort to try and adapt the AI tools to that domain, then it can actually be applied and applied valuably. I guess in my world, I would have early on not expected the impact that we're seeing in coding and software engineering, and actually that's now, it seems looking back really silly to not have seen the impact that it would start to have, but it just, from that early stage of it being natural language, you didn't really see how the same method could be adapted. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Where is the ethical challenges? So for instance, when I spoke to Megan in the past about her role at the BBC, and they were obviously their concerns around ethics in AI and how the models were being developed and how it could, on the recommendation engine, be recommending programmes to you but potentially not to other people because there was bias in the models, and that was an issue. Where would your concerns be, or ethical concerns be, with the data sets around obviously like cancer diagnostics and whatnot? What would be the concerns you would have?
Yeah, I think so. The ethical concerns I have, I think the ethical concerns are probably not new ones, right? And I think it's true maybe across how we think about ethics for AI. The ethical questions probably don't change. They just change the lens that we look at them through changes. So, it would be the same questions I would have and concerns I would have thinking about accumulation or gathering of data for cancer diagnostics. My concern would be, where's the bias in the data? How is the data being collected? How is it then being used? And is it being used to select for certain groups of people that may have access to healthcare, whereas other groups of people may not have access to healthcare? But I suppose with AI, that just brings that into really, really sharp focus, because at least I suppose at the front end, you're taking the human out of the loop, or there's a potential for taking the human out of the loop. So I think the checks and balances are really, really important. The data, I suppose, it is the same as the data would be before the advent of AI, but it's how the data is used and interpreted. And so having the checks in place, I think, is really, really important. And I think that kind of transfers over to when you think about, for example, this is not in healthcare directly anymore, but if you think about facial recognition software and how it can be used to make decisions about, for example, in the US, who has access to healthcare, who doesn't have access to healthcare, if it's being used in the legal system to make decisions about incarceration, all of these things, I think there's the potential for certain groups to be excluded or targeted because the data that we collect is, I think, inherently biased. I think, we have data sets which I don't think they can be unbiased. So it's where does the decision making lie? And how can we account for that? And is it possible to account for that? And is it possible to reduce the bias in data sets? I think, yeah, obviously it is. But if you think about healthcare, historic data really doesn't do well at accounting for the female physiology. So our data is already, skewed away from being optimal for caring for women that are not generally of the same physique as men. So yeah, how do we account for that? How do we think about bias? How do we keep that at the center of our focus and keep people at the center of our focus when we are trying to save time, save money? I suppose if you think about the NHS, of course, there's a need to save money. There's an imperative to save time. But I think we need to be really careful that we have ethical frameworks in place to make sure that we do that properly. That was a bit of a long one.
No, I was going to ask, Megan, it's been a while since I chatted to you about AI and ethics, but you talked, I thought you made a great point, Kirsty, about the same question marks apply across any industry or to any specific domain. So how is it in the commercial industry now, Megan? Is it a case that data sets are becoming more unbiased and there's better results but for that? Or has there been improvements made? Or is it still the same as what we spoke about in the past?
I would say that data collection only increases in terms of the volume of data that we have access to and the number of contacts and individuals on whom it's collected about. So I think there is gradually an improvement in the coverage and inclusion of different people demographics and groups within data as it's being collected, which helps. But I think to Kirsty's point, there is so much historic bias built in. And when we consider the advances in the AI side, they have hoovered up increasing amount of that historic data from the internet, from books, from Reddit and all sorts of different sources. So there's almost a case that there is more risk in the overall landscape because there is just so many spaces in which bias could be present and could be a part of training sets and a part of what is being used to build AI tools. I'd say it's kind of, it's being pushed on both sides. There are improvements being made very routinely to data sets, and some of them very purposeful to try and unlock bias that has already been acknowledged and understood. But the increasing numbers of data sets that are being used to train models, I think there isn't a hope of making sure that those are bias free. And some of the mitigations and guardrails that you have to put in place have to come very far upstream of the data collection point. So it's a very complicated picture where some things are improving, some things are either more complex or getting worse. And the result is that I think we just need to take more and more care. And we really, that education point that Kirsty's making of making sure that people know when to look for bias and guard for it and make sure that they're making decisions with that in mind, it's ever more important. We can't let ourselves get into a place where we just overly trust the machine to have solved it for us and to have reduced or mediated itself for the bias. That's just not acceptable. We have to be guarding for it being present at all times, and I think that's increasingly something we need to expect of any technologist who's building systems that operate at scale. It's one thing for the end user to be conscious and aware as a responsible user, but if you're building a system and you could perpetuate that bias, if you think about the diagnostic situation, you're putting a system in the hands of people who could be, receiving decisions on a routine basis that inherently have bias in them. You need to have found a way to make that system adjust to that bias and account for it properly. So such a high expectation and accountability for the people that are doing the building and the distribution of the systems. So yeah, I think a huge amount has changed since we first started speaking about it, Chris. I think the scale of being able to get it wrong has just got massive now.
What's the situation for a student then? So if you're undergrad or master's or PhD, Kirsten, you're one of your students, is it about the amount of research that they're doing and what that research is based on, whether it's like documents or research papers that have been done before, or if they're using an accumulation of different sources but using GenAI to analyse that and summarise it for them? How do you see that as how students are interacting with it and the you've obviously just mentioned the concerns, but has there been a massive difference in how they use the tools?
Yeah, so that's something we're kind of actively investigating. We incorporated the MOOC into chemistry year 2 curriculum, so it's just over 100 students. But before we did that, we kind of surveyed with ethical approval. We surveyed the students on their kind of perspectives on AI, how they were using AI anonymously, and then did the same after they'd completed the MOOC. And I think it's interesting to see if the MOOC itself has any impact. But more broadly, I think students are beginning to become more comfortable with being open about how they're using AI tools. And I think that parallels the university being more open about having conversations about AI and also moving towards a kind of general ethos where the feeling is, okay, we want to support students to use AI critically, to use AI tools that are effective in whatever, if they're in a certain research area, there will be AI tools that may be really, really effective in that area. Or equally, if you're an undergraduate student and you have a specific task, there may be AI tools that are really helpful for that. Reducing the students' ability or desire to be creative and think critically, and for the work to be the students' own work, because that is really important. We talk a lot about academic integrity at the university, which is important, but I think when we talk about ethics in AI, maybe in academia generally, we've been a bit too laser focused on academic integrity as if that's the only ethical question when it comes to students, and I think that's just not the case. Like, students are really interested in what is the environmental impact of using AI tools. They're really interested in the bias that we've talked about and how that might show up in the outputs of AI. So I think there is like a concern and a fear, but I think that's lessening as the universities kind of open up conversations about AI. But I think students are, yeah, they're probably very effective users of AI, but not because they've necessarily learned to be so at the university. I think they're using it, lots of different technologies in their everyday lives. We do have the student learning development team, which is a great team, and they produce kind of policy and support for students in lots of areas, including AI. So that's good. And we have a kind of a traffic light system, but it's available for course leaders to decide. No AI use red, some AI use amber, and like free for all green. But which okay. But I think it leaves ambiguity.
Do you determine that by reading their work? Do you determine that yourself, or do you use a tool to understand that for you?
So the course leader, whoever that is, will determine in this course what is our cut off, like, and then we'll talk to students about that. But how do you determine what the student has used? I think that's the other thing that I think is the kind of elephant in the room. Like, there's no way of accurately identifying.
I've got a cheeky
and why
question.
Would you want to?
I've got a cheeky question about the kind of evolution of that sort of maturity in building education and description of responsible use. Do you think it's had an impact on how much you're seeing quite egregious and blatant misuse of AI tools? Is that changing?
I think, a lack of academic integrity or the possibility of that is as old as the hills. And so I don't think that the advent of misuse has been brought on by AI. And I think there was a lot of fear around that as well, that AI, everyone's going to cheat. And well, if people want to cheat, they'll cheat anyway. Yeah, AI tools maybe make that easier, but I would say I haven't seen egregious misuse. I've seen accidental misuse, and students just not being clear about what plagiarism might be in the context of AI. But I think often that's understandable because it is a different realm to just reference in a journal article. So I would say no, and it might be naive, but I think we tend to, as groups of people, behave the way we're expected to. So I think if we're positive about students and positive about their intentions, and we think, well, they're good citizens and responsible citizens, I think they tend to be that, whether they have AI tools or not.
And then do you think that while you're speaking with students so regularly about the best practice for AI, is it important for you as a lecturer and for the academic staff in general to be using AI on a daily basis, and how much does that matter in this?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question, and I think it's a bit of a contentious question because there are groups of academics, or there are academics who would firmly say, I don't think AI should be used at all. I'm certainly not using it, whether that's for an ethical reason or just because they just don't think it has a place in academia. So, and I don't think that there's really a place for there to be a diktat. Everyone needs to use AI and everyone needs to understand it. But I do think that we have a responsibility as educators to the degree that is possible, understand the tools that students are using and be able to support them to navigate those and to use them effectively, but also to use them with a critical eye. So for me, it is actually really important to be trying out tools and using them with the knowledge that there's an environmental impact to me using tools, and that I want to be aware of the bias that's associated with them and the outputs and how that might affect things. So I think that staff talking about AI use and using it and being able to speak with students on a kind of peer level is really important. But I don't think that is happening across the board, because there are people that just are like, I just don't think it has.
Yeah.
And how you bring them on board is difficult.
One last question on that theme. Sorry, Chris, being very selfish.
No, sorry.
Do you think it's currently possible for a student to go through their entire undergraduate degree effectively now without engaging with AI or using it in some respects?
Good question.
That's a really good question. So we're talking only about their degree, not about living as a human through their degree, right?
Yeah.
Because I think living as a human through their degree, probably no, it's not possible. But to simply focus on their studies, their degree, I think it depends on the degree, probably.
Sure.
But if I'm just going to take chemistry, yeah, I think it is possible. Like there's an interesting difference between the AI use of our undergrads and PhD students.
Mm-hmm.
So undergrads are using AI much more than PhD students, because there's just a slight generational difference. So, there are PhD students that are doing research that are not using AI regularly, and they're managing just fine. So I think it is possible, but I think, unfortunately, the reality is that if you're not using AI at all, then certain mundane tasks you're doing less efficiently, and so you are at a disadvantage, I think.
Yeah. So you're opening up less time for that deep focus on value.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Super
I wanted
interesting.
to just for a minute, only a couple more questions, but step away from academia and back into industry. So we talked about the healthcare and big pharma sectors. Mm-hmm. You talked about obviously how AI is helping them with things like rapid diagnosis of the amount of images that they can process and analysing those images, and then obviously putting that back into the products. But going back on that ethical question, if that's all been done on biased data sets, is there a concern of the outcomes that come from that, and potentially where you get prescriptions or whatever the consumer then as a user of the products that they're getting from these types of businesses? Is there concerns there, or do you think that that's only really advantages that have came from AI in the sort of healthcare market?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that at the moment, and this might be changing right now, and it might not be true in a week's time, but I think at the moment, where AI tools are being used, for example, in imaging in healthcare, so in the NHS, I think at the moment it's alongside actual doctors looking at images, and there's always a comparison. So at the moment it's not a replacement for doctors trained in that specialism making the final decision. So I think in lots of ways it's really, really helpful, because you have then almost like an additional training for the doctors, or an additional comparison for the doctors about that decision making, but it's never taken out of the hands of the doctors. I wouldn't be too concerned in terms of specific examples of where imaging technologies are being used in the NHS or something like that. I think where I have concern, and it's about data sets rather than necessarily how they're being used differently in AI systems. But I think there's always been a question, if you're thinking about pharma or biotech or the development of new drugs, there's always been a question about how that data is gathered, the data sets, who might be excluded from those data sets. Usually safety data is paramount and is really, really strong, but that's safety data based on a restricted population of people. So I'm not concerned particularly more than I would have been before AI was being used in these systems, but I am concerned because I would be concerned about data anyway.
Do you think your view on that imaging use and how its impact has been positive and well managed is partly due to already having quite a mature ethical framework within healthcare already? Has that been crucial there?
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, because I think one area of science where we're really good at training people in ethics is in medicine, for an obvious reason. Like, someone has a scalpel in their hand, they're having to make real life ethical decisions that can, be life or death decisions. So there's like a real tradition of very clear ethical training in healthcare and in the medical profession. But I think it's really interesting that that doesn't translate to other sciences. So all through my training as a chemist, a chemical biologist, I don't think I ever had any education in ethics as part of that. And I think that's still generally true. But I think that all of us are making ethical decisions in our professions or in our areas every day. And it kind of comes back to that thing about the questions or the dilemmas they're not new, and you can translate, ethical or philosophical structures to different decision situations. And so that ethical training, I think, is just really, really important. And I would be a big advocate for including ethics in our education, like right from digital literacy and ethical literacy, right from school level, I think would be really important going forward.
Yeah, I think the extent to which it's not included in some of those core academic disciplines that lead to a lot of the data science and AI professions is quite worrying still. It's sort of, in my experience within my career, it's often the focus of someone who's passionate and informed themselves. It's not the provision of someone who happens to have found education driving that or industry driving that. It's very much like well-intentioned, good citizens that have picked it up and are doing it quite often as a side of desk activity without very much direct investment, which I totally agree with you. That needs to it needs to be far earlier as an emphasis, and it needs to be much more systemic across different fields, I think, to be effective.
For sure. I think just on that, I think it's, in some cases, it's like quite a privileged position to be in, to have the opportunity to have that interest and to develop it. But I think I would be really keen for that to be really democratized. Like, it should be, ethical training and digital literacies should be available irrespective of your demographic, from school level up.
Perfect. I think that's a really good place to tie in. I was just going to mention just lastly, I think it possibly ties in, but obviously with the link with you've been a chemistry lecturer and obviously been at Glasgow Uni, but Glasgow Uni have got a spin out Chemify, have they not, that are using AI?
Yeah.
I've just seen that obviously they got their Series B funding, so hiring or bringing a lot of engineers, software engineers, AI engineers into the business. So that's been a really good success story for, I would imagine, you're part of the university.
Yeah, huge success story, and kudos to them. It's very quickly making huge strides. It's not the only spin-off from chemistry either. That there are others in other areas. So yeah, I mean, I'm really optimistic about the possibilities and the opportunities of AI in chemistry and in other sciences, and generally really optimistic about it. But I'm kind of also realistic that, I'm hopeful that we think about the benefits reaching lots of people and not just some.
No, brilliant, Kirsten. It's been great to have you on. Megan, as always, thank you very much for your input and I hope you enjoyed it.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Dawn.
Thanks,
thank you.